The desert was supposed to be a place of adventure and serenity, far away from the chaos of city life. Eager to escape into the vast expanse of the sandy wilderness under the starlit sky, we arrived at our chosen spot just before sunset, a secluded area surrounded by towering dunes, with the promise of an unforgettable night ahead. As darkness fell, we set up our tents, the warm glow of our campfire flickering against the encroaching shadows. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of the desert, the wind whispering through the dunes, and the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. We gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, laughter echoing into the void of night. For a while, everything felt perfect. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to creep in. The laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I glanced around at my friends, their faces illuminated by the firelight, and noticed their smiles had faded, replaced by expressions of discomfort. I wasn't the only one feeling it. Something was off. It started with strange noises. At first, it was just the wind, but then we began to hear what sounded like footsteps crunching in the sand, circling our campsite. We all laughed nervously, attributing it to our overactive imaginations. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the vastness of the desert could easily play tricks on our minds. Then came the shadows. They danced just beyond the reach of our firelight, flitting between the dunes. I tried to convince myself it was just the movement of the wind or animals, but deep down, I felt a growing dread. The laughter faded entirely as we began to share uneasy glances. It was getting late, and we were all feeling it. Around midnight, the air turned cold, a chill that seeped into our bones. I decided to venture away from the fire to relieve myself. As I walked into the darkness, the sounds of the desert felt amplified. Every crunch of sand beneath my feet echoed like a warning. I turned to look back at the fire, the warm glow now just a small circle of safety in an endless sea of darkness. Just then, I heard it, a low growl, something deep and primal. It sent shivers down my spine. I froze, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. I hurried back to the fire, heart racing, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they all looked equally unnerved. We huddled closer together, the firelight flickering as the wind picked up. The shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward us, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being surrounded. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the other side of our campsite. We all jumped, eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" one of my friends whispered, voice trembling. We turned to look, hearts pounding in our chests. Another thud, closer this time, and then silence. We decided to check our tents, convinced that whatever it was must be an animal. But as we approached, we noticed something horrifying. The zippers of our tents had been pulled down, and the insides were in disarray. Panic surged through us as we realized we weren't alone. "Let's get the hell out of here," I shouted, adrenaline kicking in. We scrambled to gather our things, but as we did, we heard it again, the growl, now louder, more menacing. It was close, too close for comfort. We made a break for it, running toward the car parked a few yards away. The shadows moved around us, darting between the dunes, and I felt a presence behind me, stalking me through the darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps followed, echoing in the stillness. Just as we reached the car, I turned to see what was chasing us. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of something hunched and grotesque, its skin a sickly shade of grey, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. We fumbled with the car doors, finally getting inside just as the creature lunged toward us. Heart racing, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of the campsite, kicking up sand as we sped away. I glanced back only once, and what I saw still haunts me, a figure standing on the dunes, silhouetted against the moonlight, watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, shaken and terrified. Our adventure turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye, and the desert, once a place of tranquility, became a haunting memory. We never spoke of that night again, but the fear lingered, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful places can hide the darkest secrets. The mountains had always called to me, their towering peaks promising adventure and solitude. My friends and I decided to escape the chaos of city life for a weekend camping trip in the heart of the Rockies. With a cooler full of supplies and our gear packed tightly into the car, we drove into the wilderness, excitement buzzing in the air. As we arrived at our campsite, nestled among towering pines and overlooking a serene lake, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. We set up our tents, laughter echoing through the trees as we shared stories and roasted marshmallows over the crackling campfire. The ambience was perfect, but as night fell, an unsettling silence descended upon us, wrapping the campsite in a heavy blanket of darkness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off as a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced at my friends, but they seemed oblivious, lost in their own conversations. As darkness enveloped the campsite, I decided to retire to my tent early, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my gut. I zipped the entrance closed, cocooning myself in my sleeping bag, but sleep eluded me. The wind howled outside, and I could hear distant rustling, like footsteps in the underbrush. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the side of my tent. My heart raced as I listened, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of my own panicked breathing. I peered through the fabric, seeing nothing but shadows dancing in the moonlight. The thud came again, followed by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. Was it an animal, or something worse? I lay still, heart pounding, until I heard the muffled voices of my friends outside. They were arguing, their voices laced with fear. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, the cold air biting at my skin. "What's going on?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's out there," my friend Mark said, eyes wide with terror. "We heard it moving around, and then it slammed into your tent." We huddled together, casting anxious glances toward the tree line, where the darkness seemed to pulse and breathe. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that makes you feel vulnerable and exposed. "We need to stick together," I urged, though my mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking just beyond the firelight. Just then, we heard a rustling noise coming from the bushes nearby. It was followed by a series of soft whispers, unintelligible but haunting. My stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, fear etched across their faces. As we prepared to retreat to the safety of our tents, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to call out to us, luring us deeper into the shadows. I felt a pull, a curiosity that gnawed at my insides. "What if it's someone lost?" I suggested, though deep down I knew that the woods were empty. We hesitated, but the urge to investigate was too strong. Cautiously, we ventured toward the sound, flashlights in hand, the beam slicing through the inky blackness. As we moved deeper into the woods, the whispers transformed into frantic shouts, echoing around us, almost mocking our presence. Suddenly, we stumbled upon a clearing, and to our horror, we saw what appeared to be a makeshift campsite. Torn tents lay scattered on the ground, and remnants of a fire smoldered in the center. But it wasn't the campsite that filled us with dread, it was the sight of scattered belongings, and the unmistakable bloodstains leading into the woods. Panic surged through us, and we turned to run, but as we did, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was cloaked in shadow, eyes glinting with a predatory glimmer. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, voice low and gravelly. "You're not safe." We bolted back toward our campsite, adrenaline propelling us forward, but the sounds of pursuit echoed behind us. The whispers returned, now taunting, filling our minds with dread. We reached our tents, scrambling inside, but the terror didn't stop. The figure was outside now, pacing and watching. In the darkness, I felt the weight of despair settle over us. What if we don't make it out? I thought, heart racing as I clutched my friends close. The tension reached a breaking point, and we huddled together, desperate for safety. Just as I thought all hope was lost, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The figure outside hesitated, confusion evident in its stance. Seizing the opportunity, we bolted from our tents, racing toward the sound of approaching help. As we reached the clearing, we saw headlights piercing through the trees. Relief washed over us, but just as we turned to look back, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The authorities arrived, and we recounted our harrowing experience. They found the abandoned campsite, but no trace of the figure. As we sat in the safety of the patrol car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse than we could imagine. Weeks passed, and we returned to our lives, but the memory of that night lingered on. I kept hearing whispers in the wind, reminding me that the mountains, once a sanctuary, could also be a graveyard for those who wandered too far into the shadows. The Amazon rainforest was a dream destination for my friends and me, a chance to explore the world and experience nature in its purest form. We arrived with excitement bubbling in our veins, ready to embark on an adventure that promised to be unforgettable. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight, creating a surreal atmosphere as we set up our campsite near a winding river. As night fell, we gathered around a crackling fire, sharing stories and laughter, while the sounds of the jungle enveloped us. The air was thick with humidity, and the chorus of insects and distant animal calls filled the night. It felt alive, magical, but as the fire burned low, an unsettling sensation began to creep in. I remember the first time I heard the sounds that would haunt our trip. It started as a faint rustling in the underbrush, almost like someone or something was moving just beyond the edge of our campsite. At first, we dismissed it as wildlife, but the sounds grew closer, and the laughter faded into uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a monkey or something," my friend Sarah replied, though her eyes betrayed her fear. But the rustling persisted, morphing into soft whispers that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't until a loud crash broke the stillness, sending us leaping to our feet, that we truly began to feel the weight of our isolation. The sound was like a heavy branch snapping, but it came from deep within the jungle, far beyond the reach of our firelight. We exchanged nervous looks, debating whether to investigate or stay put. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously ventured into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the thick foliage. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as we moved deeper into the jungle. The whispers intensified, wrapping around us like a ghostly shroud. "This isn't funny anymore," I muttered, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe it's just the wind," Mark suggested, though his voice trembled. But then we saw it, an old, weathered totem standing eerily among the trees, covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, and we instinctively knew we had stumbled upon something sacred. As we approached, the whispers grew louder, almost pleading. I could feel a chill run down my spine. "Let's get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice barely a whisper. We turned to leave, but the jungle seemed to close in around us, the path suddenly unfamiliar. Panic surged as we realized we were lost. The whispers shifted, turning into frantic cries that echoed through the trees. "Help! Help us!" They were mingled with laughter, but it was twisted and wrong. I felt as if the very jungle itself was alive, taunting us with our helplessness. We ran blindly, the darkness swallowing us whole. Every rustle in the leaves felt like a predator stalking us, and the cries grew louder, as if something was chasing us down. The terror was overwhelming, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating the area, but it was no sanctuary. It was a graveyard of bone skulls and remnants of creatures long gone, scattered across the ground. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. This was a place of sacrifice, and we had trespassed where we didn't belong. Before we could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with wild hair and eyes that glinted with madness. "You shouldn't have come here," he screamed, voice echoing with rage. "You've disturbed the spirits." We turned to flee, but the jungle seemed to come alive, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, pulling us back. The whispers grew into a cacophony of screams as the man lunged toward us, and we scrambled away, adrenaline fueling our escape. We finally found our way back to the campsite, breathless and terrified. The fire had dimmed to embers, casting eerie shadows across our gear. We packed in a frenzy, fear propelling us as we prepared to leave the cursed jungle behind. As we drove away, the whispers faded into the distance, but the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks within the heart of nature. The Amazon had revealed its true face, and we had narrowly escaped its grasp.